The mop squeaked across the marble floor, each stroke echoing louder than it should have in the glass-walled lobby. Richard Calloway didn't even look at the man pushing the bucket until his eyes caught the scuffed leather briefcase leaning against the janitor's cart. He smirked, tugging on his silk cufflinks, as though the sight itself offended him. "You carry that thing like it's worth more than the floor you're scrubbing." David Mercer didn't flinch. His voice was quiet, steady, almost too calm. Sometimes the things people overlook turn out to be the most valuable. Richard's smirk faltered for a second, just long enough for the staff passing by to notice. Then he laughed, shaking his head, the sound dripping with contempt. "Sure, janitor, keep telling yourself that." David leaned on the mop handle, gaze level, almost surgical. "Funny thing is, I've seen numbers collapse faster than you'd believe, and when they do, it won't be the man in the corner office who sees it first." The words landed like a stone in water, rippling through the silence. Richard's grin wavered before he brushed it off with a snort and walked away. If you've ever wished someone would finally put arrogant people in their place, stay with me. This story doesn't just expose a billionaire's cruelty, it proves how the quietest person in the room can end up holding all the power. Drop a like if you've ever wanted to stand up to unreasonable rules like this, and subscribe to see how this strategy plays out. The janitor. That was all anyone ever called David Mercer. No one cared about the man beneath the uniform, the one who tucked his daughter into bed every night after long shifts, or the one who carried the same briefcase he'd once set on mahogany tables in boardrooms bigger than this entire building. His silence was not weakness. It was a choice. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to defend himself. He knew exactly who he was, even if they didn't. The night air still clung to him from the walk across the parking lot, where his old sedan coughed like it might quit on him any day. He'd left Evelyn at home with her homework spread across the kitchen table, her wide eyes reminding him why he endured all of this. Every insult, every sneer, every assumption that a man with a mop had no story worth hearing. She was the reason he took every shift offered, the reason he carried that battered briefcase even though people laughed at it. Inside were the pieces of his past he'd never surrendered. Folded notes, old charts, financial models scribbled in margins from years ago. A different life, locked away, but never erased. As Richard's laughter faded down the hall, David dipped the mop again, the soft slosh masking his slow exhale. He'd seen men like Calloway before, loud, certain, untouchable. He also knew that power built on arrogance always left cracks. Where are you watching from? Because what Richard Calloway didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he'd just sneered at the one man who could unravel everything he thought untouchable. And soon, the boardroom that ignored the janitor's presence would have no choice but to hear him speak. Richard Calloway's laughter trailed down the hallway, but the sting it left behind lingered like smoke in the air. David Mercer wrung the mop head out in silence, his jaw tightening. He didn't need to glance up to know that a few employees had witnessed the exchange. He could feel their eyes skimming him, like he was some curiosity, a spectacle to fill a dull afternoon. Minutes later, he pushed his cart toward the executive floor. The elevator ride was quiet except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights and the mechanical groan of cables pulling him upward. When the doors slid open, the sharp contrast of wealth and power met him instantly. Plush carpet, modern art on the walls, the faint scent of imported cologne hanging in the air. Here, even the silence seemed expensive. Richard stood at the far end of the corridor, his voice booming through the space as he held court with his assistants. A small cluster of employees hovered, laughing at his stories like trained echoes. He spotted David moving past and raised his voice deliberately, making sure his words carried. "You know, sometimes I wonder what drives a man to settle for this." He gestured vaguely toward the mop handle with a gleam in his eye. "Scrubbing floors, carrying buckets, it can't be ambition." A ripple of awkward laughter followed. One assistant shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward David, but Richard pressed on. "Maybe it's comfort, or maybe some men just don't have the spine for more." His gaze locked on David now, the smile sharp as a blade. "Tell me, janitor, how much do you even make? Enough for a sandwich and bus fare?" The question hung in the air, cruel and calculated. David paused only briefly, letting the silence stretch. He didn't give Richard the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he straightened, shifted his grip on the mop, and continued past them without a word. His restraint was not weakness, it was defiance. Richard's smirk widened. He turned to the onlookers. "See? Nothing to say. A man who scrubs floors can't possibly understand what it takes to sit in this office." He tapped a manicured finger against the glass wall of his corner suite. Different worlds, different breeds. The staff chuckled obediently, though one or two avoided looking directly at David. Their unease was subtle, but there, a hairline fracture in the collective facade of contempt. David felt the weight of every word pressing against him like stones, but he carried it quietly, the way he always did. Years ago, he might have answered differently. Years ago, he had stood in similar hallways, delivering forecasts that made or broke futures. But now, every ounce of his energy went into something else, protecting the little girl waiting at home. He thought of Evelyn, her smile when she understood a tricky math problem, the way she hugged him tighter than anyone else, as if she sensed the battles he fought silently. She was the reason he refused to crack under men like Richard Calloway. The corridor emptied gradually as the staff dispersed, their laughter fading into smaller conversations. Richard disappeared into his office, satisfied with his display of dominance. David resumed his work with methodical calm, wiping fingerprints from glass, polishing the handles no one else noticed. But the humiliation stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after the voices were gone. Not because he believed Richard's words, but because he knew how easily others did. People believed what power told them to believe. They saw the uniform, not the man. Later that evening, when his shift ended, David stepped into the chilled night air. His car sat waiting, old and rusted, parked beside gleaming machines that belonged to executives who barely knew his name. He slid into the driver's seat and let the worn steering wheel press against his palms. For a moment, he allowed himself to sit in the stillness, to absorb the day's weight. The engine coughed alive, rattling like an old smoker's breath. As he drove, the city lights blurred past, neon streaks against the dark. His thoughts wandered, circling Richard's voice, circling the mockery, circling Evelyn. He couldn't afford distractions. He couldn't afford mistakes. When he finally reached home, the small apartment smelled faintly of tomato soup. Evelyn sat at the table, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, hunched over a worksheet. She looked up when the door opened, eyes brightening instantly. "Dad!" Her smile cut through the heaviness like sunlight. He set his briefcase on the counter, kissed the top of her head, and dropped into the chair beside her. For a few minutes, numbers and ridicule and marble floors faded. For a few minutes, it was just them. But even as he listened to her chatter, even as he laughed softly at her stubborn questions, the day's events clung to him. Richard's words weren't simply arrogance. They were the promise of future battles. Battles David would face alone, armed with little more than patience, silence, and the knowledge of who he really was beneath the uniform. He brushed a hand across the worn leather of the briefcase. It was more than a relic. It was proof. Proof of a life no one suspected. Proof that when the cracks in Richard's empire finally showed, he would be ready. And though no one else could see it yet, the balance between them had already shifted. The following morning, the corridors of Calloway Holdings buzzed with the usual rhythm of ambition, heels striking tile, clipped voices spilling from conference rooms, the smell of roasted coffee threading through the air. David Mercer pushed his cart along the executive floor, silent as always. But the tension from the previous day lingered. Words like Richard's didn't just vanish. They stuck, replayed, spread. David's mop bucket rattled faintly as he rolled it past the glass doors of the break room. Inside, two young analysts hunched over a laptop, whispering about last night's reports. He wasn't trying to listen, but their voices carried. "Numbers are off again. The reconciliation doesn't make sense," one said, scrolling furiously. "The margins don't add up. It's like something's being double counted." David paused by the doorway, adjusting the handle of his mop. The words triggered something in him, like an itch under the skin. He'd seen patterns like that before, and his mind worked automatically, laying out invisible equations, tracing the shape of errors. Without thinking, he murmured, "Check your foreign exchange entries against last quarter's hedging. That's where the spread usually hides." The room went still. Both analysts turned, blinking at him as though a ghost had spoken. "What?" the taller one asked. David straightened, realizing too late he'd said the thought aloud. His tone was even, unshaken. "The discrepancy. It's probably sitting in your FX hedges. You won't balance the sheets until you account for that exposure." The younger analyst frowned, suspicious, but curiosity flickered in his eyes. He tapped furiously on the keyboard. Numbers shifted on the screen. Then his mouth opened, stunned. "He's right. It's exactly that." His partner leaned back, staring at David like he'd grown another head. "How the hell would you know that?" David met their gaze for a brief second, then adjusted his grip on the mop. "Some things aren't as complicated as they look." He turned and continued down the hall, leaving the analysts whispering behind him. Word spread quickly, as it always did in offices where gossip traveled faster than memos. By noon, Clara Jennings had heard. She was a mid-level manager, sharp enough to recognize when something didn't add up. The story found its way to her desk between budget reports and unanswered emails. The janitor who solved a reconciliation problem in one sentence. She found herself watching him later that afternoon as he polished the brass handles near the elevators. His posture was ordinary, almost invisible, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered on the scrolling stock ticker on the lobby's news screen, scanning it with a familiarity most of her team couldn't fake. "David, right?" she asked, stepping closer. He glanced up. "Yes, ma'am. I heard something about you earlier, that you pointed out a fix in the quarterly reports." David's expression didn't shift. "I just overheard a problem." Clara tilted her head. "Most janitors wouldn't know what a hedge exposure is." He gave a faint shrug. "Most people don't ask them what they know?" She held his gaze for a long moment. There was something in his tone, calm, measured, unbothered, that unsettled her. It wasn't arrogance, it was the opposite, confidence that didn't need to be proven. "Well," she said finally, it caught attention. David nodded once and returned to his work, but Clara lingered, curiosity gnawing at her. She had sat through enough meetings to recognize the cadence of someone who understood finance, not someone repeating jargon they'd overheard. That night, Clara mentioned it quietly to a colleague over coffee. By the next morning, the whispers were louder. Some dismissed it as luck. Others wondered if the janitor had some odd hobby, a fascination with markets. A few leaned in closer, asking themselves the question Clara couldn't shake. Who was this man before he held a mop? David ignored the whispers, but he could feel them following him through the halls. Eyes lingered longer. Conversations faltered when he entered a room. He kept his head down, but inside, the old instinct stirred. The numbers came to him easily, uninvited but precise, as though the years between hadn't existed. That evening, as he drove home in his rattling sedan, Evelyn chattered from the back seat about a science project. David smiled faintly, but his thoughts lingered on the break room, on the look in those analysts' eyes, on Clara Jennings, watching him like she'd seen a flicker of something no one else noticed. He gripped the wheel tighter. He hadn't meant to slip. He'd promised himself this life was behind him, that the boardrooms and balance sheets and endless games of men like Richard Calloway were no longer his world. But old truths had a way of leaking through the cracks, and whether he wanted it or not, the cracks were beginning to show. The next morning dawned with sharp sunlight cutting across the glass facade of Calloway Holdings, making the tower gleam like a jewel above the city. David Mercer entered quietly through the side entrance, the worn wheels of his mop bucket clicking against polished tile. The building always smelled faintly of citrus polish and fresh paper in the early hours, an expensive sterility that felt at odds with the lives lived inside. Upstairs, the executive boardroom was already a theater of spectacle. Richard Calloway stood at the head of the table, tall and immaculately dressed, his voice booming like a preacher at the pulpit. The mahogany surface gleamed beneath the weight of crystal glasses and silver pens, symbols of power deliberately displayed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard said, drawing out the words as though savoring them, "while our competitors tighten their belts, we expand. While others chase scraps, we devour the feast." His grin flashed, white and predatory. The room erupted with applause and nervous laughter. Assistants scribbled notes they would never read again, nodding as if every word was scripture. Richard raised a hand, basking in the silence that followed. From the far corner of the room, half hidden behind the catering trays he was meant to clear, David watched. His uniform blended with the shadows, his movements efficient and quiet, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, took in the glossy graphs projected on the wall. He saw the overinflated margins, the risky expansions disguised as triumphs. The numbers whispered warnings to him, warnings no one else seemed willing to hear. Richard strutted along the length of the table. "You'll notice," he said, pointing with a Mont Blanc pen worth more than David's car. "Our quarterly growth remains unmatched. Callaway Holdings is untouchable. The market bends to us, not the other way around." The board members nodded, some with genuine enthusiasm, others with the weary compliance of those who knew better but lacked courage. David's fingers tightened briefly around the silver tray he held. He had once spoken numbers with that same conviction, except he'd understood that arrogance was a debt always waiting to be collected. Richard's gaze swept the room until it landed briefly on David. The pause was deliberate. "And there," he said, gesturing with a careless flick, "is the man who cleans up after us. Proof, gentlemen, that the world is built on hierarchy. Some of us make decisions and some—" His smirk deepened. "Push mops." Laughter echoed. It wasn't the sound of joy, but of obedience, a chorus rehearsed out of fear. David lowered his eyes, collected the trays, and moved toward the door. The humiliation bit at him, sharp and cold, but he refused to let Richard see it land. Silence was his shield, the same shield he'd used for years. Yet beneath that silence, a fire stirred. He couldn't help but think of Evelyn, of the lessons she was learning about men like this. Richard tapped the table with his pen. "Remember, appearances matter. This is why we sit here, because we know the game, and they—" Another glance at David's retreating back. "Never will." The meeting resumed with projections and plans, but the damage was already done. Richard's arrogance had once again turned David into a prop in his theater of dominance. In the corridor, David set the trays on his cart and paused. The muffled roar of Richard's voice continued through the glass walls, punctuated by bursts of sycophantic laughter. David pressed a hand to his briefcase, resting where he always kept it tucked under the cart. The leather was worn smooth by years of use, but inside were pages of numbers and analyses as sharp as any blade. He didn't want this fight, not here, not now. But fate had a way of dragging truth into light. By late afternoon, Clara Jennings found herself replaying what she'd heard in the break room the day before. She passed David in the hallway, noticing the calm way he moved, the unhurried precision of someone who knew he had nothing to prove. Richard's words from the boardroom still rang in her ears, but Clara's instincts disagreed. She slowed, letting her gaze linger on David longer than usual. Something about the way he looked at those charts in the boardroom, too focused, too practiced, was wrong for a janitor. Or perhaps, she thought uneasily, it was exactly right for someone who wasn't what he seemed. Inside the boardroom, Richard basked in applause, blind to the cracks widening beneath his empire. And outside, in the quiet corridors of glass and steel, David Mercer carried his silence like a weapon, biding his time. The hum of the building never really stopped, not even late at night. Elevators groaned, computers whirred softly, and the glow of digital clocks lit empty offices. David Mercer moved silently through the upper floors, pushing his cart along polished corridors that reflected the faint light. The building had its rhythms. By now, he knew them as well as his own heartbeat. That evening, a ripple of panic disturbed the usual calm. 2 IT technicians darted back and forth outside the server room, voices sharp and hurried. The door was propped open, spilling a harsh fluorescent glow into the hallway. David slowed, sensing the disruption before he even reached them. "Systems down again," one muttered, tugging at his tie as sweat collected along his brow. "If the backups don't reset before the morning reports, Callaway's gonna lose his mind." The other crouched beside the humming unit, wires snaking from the casing like exposed veins. He tapped frantically on a console, but the screen flickered and went black. "I don't get it. It's like the circuits are choking themselves. We'll need to call someone in." David leaned his mop against the wall, peering inside the server room, as casually as if checking for a spill. His eyes skimmed the open panel. He saw the fault almost immediately. an overloaded circuit pulling more than its share, tripping the system into a loop, a rookie mistake, but one that could cost hours. The younger technician groaned. "This is ridiculous. We'll be here all night." Without speaking, David stepped forward. Both technicians froze, startled to see the janitor crossing the threshold. He knelt, his hands steady, and traced a line of wires to the breaker. "Your auxiliary relay is misaligned," he said quietly. "It's feeding back into itself." The men blinked. "You need to reset from the bypass, not the main switch," David continued. He reached up and flicked the correct lever, the movement smooth and practiced. The servers blinked, whirred, then hummed back to life, their status lights glowing steady green. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. The older technician finally found his voice. How did you know that?" David stood, dusting his hands. His face was unreadable, calm. "Patterns repeat. Once you've seen them, you don't forget." He picked up his mop and cart as though nothing unusual had happened, leaving the technicians gaping after him. Their whispers followed, him down the hall, carrying the same mix of awe and unease he'd heard in the break room earlier that week. By the next morning, the whispers had multiplied. Some said he'd guessed. Others swore he had a background in engineering. A few even joked that the janitor could probably run the company better than half the executives. The story slipped from floor to floor like spilled ink, seeping into corners Richard Calloway could not control. Clara Jennings heard it too. She lingered near the coffee machine, overhearing analysts marveling at the maintenance guy who rebooted the servers like he'd built them himself. Something about the conviction in their voices unsettled her. This wasn't luck anymore. This was a pattern. Later that day, Clara spotted David polishing the chrome elevator doors. She hesitated, then approached. "I heard you fixed the server problem last night." David didn't look up. "It wasn't much." "That's not what I heard." She studied him, her expression tightening. "You keep surprising people. Finance errors, server failures. You're always right where the cracks show." His hand slowed over the cloth, but his eyes remained on the reflective surface. "Sometimes people miss what's right in front of them." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Clara felt a chill as she considered them. He spoke like someone who had lived in both worlds, the one that built the numbers and the one that cleaned up the mess. "Who are you really, David?" she asked softly. He finally met her gaze in the mirror, his expression calm but unreadable. A father, a worker, nothing more. But Clara wasn't convinced. She walked away unsettled, carrying his words like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Inside his chest, David's heart beat heavier than he let on. Every slip, every correction, every moment he revealed too much. It chipped at the wall he had built around his past. He had wanted only silence, only survival. But silence was beginning to betray him. That night, he drove home through streets washed in neon and rain. Evelyn was waiting at the table again, her small hands smudged with pencil marks. She looked up, beaming, as he stepped inside. "Dad, I finished early today." Her voice steadied him, her smile anchored him. He kissed the top of her head and sat beside her, pushing aside the weight of the day. Yet, as he opened his briefcase to tuck away her finished worksheets with quiet pride, the sight of old documents peeking from beneath them made his chest tighten. Charts, formulas, forecasts. They whispered of who he had been, and though he wanted nothing more than to leave it buried, the world around him was beginning to dig. The hospital's sterile white walls smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear. David Mercer sat in a plastic chair outside the examination room, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale. The soft hum of distant machines filled the silence, broken only when a nurse's shoes clicked against tile. Evelyn had collapsed that afternoon at school. Her teacher had called in a panic, describing how the 10-year-old had swayed during recess before crumpling to the ground. By the time David arrived, his daughter was pale, her small frame shaking in the nurse's office. Now she was asleep under observation, an IV line feeding into her arm. David leaned forward, elbows pressed to his knees. His chest was tight, but not from fear alone. It was the familiar weight of responsibility. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Evelyn needed him steady, just as she always had. The door opened and the doctor stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Mercer," he said softly. She's stable, likely just a fainting spell, but with her history of anemia, we'll run a few tests to be sure. Relief loosened David's shoulders, though only slightly. He nodded. Thank you. When Evelyn stirred awake, he sat at her bedside, stroking her hair back gently. Her eyelids fluttered open, eyes glassy but alert. Dad? I'm here. His voice was calm, steady, though inside he felt cracked. You didn't leave? Never, he whispered, not for a second. Later that evening, he carried her to the car, her arms looped loosely around his neck. The hospital's fluorescent lights spilled over them as he walked, highlighting the contrast between the worn jacket draped over his shoulders and the sleek cars gliding past outside. His own sedan waited with its dented side and squealing brakes, a machine long past its prime. But it was theirs, dependable in its own way. As he buckled Evelyn in, she asked, Will you miss work tomorrow? David hesitated. Work meant stability. Work meant keeping food on the table, the roof over their heads. But looking at her pale face, he knew the answer. If you need me, I'll stay. The next morning, however, life's grind returned quickly. Richard Calloway's voice thundered across the executive floor, pulling David back into a world that cared little for sick children or sleepless fathers. David had arrived 10 minutes late, only once in months, and Richard seized the opportunity like a predator spotting blood. Well, well, Richard sneered from his glass office doorway, his words carrying for the entire corridor to hear. Our floor scrubber finally decided to show up. What's the excuse? Traffic? Alarm didn't go off? Or were you too busy counting your pennies? The employees nearby chuckled nervously, eyes flicking between the two men. David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Richard stepped closer, his designer shoes clicking against the carpet. He leaned in, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide it from the audience. Let me tell you something, Mercer. In this world, you show up or you're nothing. You think anyone cares why you're late? You're replaceable. Always remember that. David's eyes flicked toward his cart, where his briefcase rested, hidden beneath the mop rags. Replaceable. The word echoed in his mind, searing deeper than Richard could ever know. He thought of Evelyn, her tiny voice asking if he'd miss work for her. He thought of her pale skin under hospital lights. Replaceable? Number not to her. The laughter faded as employees dispersed, eager to avoid the uncomfortable weight lingering in the air. Richard sauntered back into his office, satisfied with the display of dominance. David returned to his work, each movement controlled, deliberate. Outwardly, he remained calm. Inside, a different resolve was hardening. Richard thought a man's worth was measured in wealth, in titles, in appearances. But David knew better. That night, as he sat with Evelyn over a dinner of reheated soup and toast, he felt her small hand slip into his. She squeezed gently. Dad, you're not nothing. He smiled faintly, but the fire in his chest burned brighter. She was his anchor, his proof, his reason. And though Richard Calloway could not see it yet, every insult, every humiliation was pushing David closer to the moment when silence would no longer be enough. For now, he held the mask of the quiet janitor. But soon, when the cracks in Calloway's empire widened, the mask would fall. The storm broke on a Thursday afternoon. Richard Calloway's voice boomed down the corridor long before David Mercer saw him. The CEO's usual swagger was missing, replaced by sharp edges of panic. Assistants scurried like shadows in his wake, clutching stacks of papers, tablets glowing with urgent numbers. David was polishing the brass railing near the executive suite when Richard stormed past. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. "This is a disaster!" he barked, snatching a folder from a trembling analyst. $2 million doesn't just disappear. Where the hell is it? The words carried, ricocheting off glass and marble. Staff froze in place, eyes wide, whispers starting immediately. The number was too large, too damning to ignore. David kept his posture calm, but the words sank deep. 2 million missing. His mind ticked over the possibilities instinctively. Allocation errors, double entries, hedging miscalculations. Old habits roared back to life before he could silence them. Richard slammed the folder down on a reception desk, startling the receptionist. He stabbed a finger at the documents. "Fix it. Do you hear me? Fix it before the board meets tomorrow. If I walk into that room with a hole in the accounts, I'll be crucified." The analyst stammered something about checking the ledgers again. Richard cut him off. "I don't want excuses. I want solutions. Now." He stormed back into his office, the glass door shutting with a violent snap. The hallway exhaled in his absence, but the tension clung to the air. David bent back to his work, cloth gliding over brass, but his thoughts churned. He had seen it before, numbers that didn't add up, panic dressed as command. He remembered boardrooms where millions shifted hands with the stroke of a pen, where arrogance blinded men until the fall came crashing down. And now, here it was again, unraveling before him. That evening, the building quieted as most employees fled, eager to escape the storm brewing upstairs. David lingered, pushing his cart past the executive offices. Richard's lights still burned, his silhouette pacing back and forth behind frosted glass. When the office door cracked open, David caught a glimpse of the chaos inside, papers scattered across the desk, charts glowing red on the screen. Richard's voice low but frantic as he barked into the phone. "I don't care what it takes. Bury it, move it, delay it, just get that hole covered." David's chest tightened. Covering a gap that size wasn't just desperate, it was reckless. Someone would catch it. Investors, auditors, the board. And when they did, the empire Richard flaunted would collapse under its own weight. David turned away, his mop swishing softly over the floor. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He was just a janitor now, just a father, keeping his head down, protecting Evelyn. But as he passed his cart, his gaze fell on the leather briefcase tucked beneath the rags. The old weight of it tugged at him, the life he had buried pressing against the surface. His silence was a shield, yes. But silence had limits. The following morning, the panic had only grown. Staff whispered openly now. Rumors spread like wildfire, embezzlement, accounting fraud, hidden debts. The number kept repeating. 2 million, too large to ignore, too specific to dismiss. David was wiping down the glass near the boardroom when Clara Jennings approached, her expression tight. She lowered her voice. "You heard what's happening?" He didn't look up. "Hard not to. They're scrambling. No one can find where the money went." She hesitated, studying him. "You worked with numbers before, didn't you?" David's grip on the cloth stilled. Slowly he turned, meeting her eyes. She held his gaze with quiet determination, no longer asking out of idle curiosity. It was suspicion now. Suspicion and something like hope. He said nothing, only folded the cloth neatly against the railing. Clara frowned, frustration flashing across her face. "They'll burn people for this. Everyone caught in the blast will take the fall. If you know something..." Her words were cut short by the slam of the boardroom door. Richard emerged, pale but furious, his tie loosened, sweat beading on his forehead. "Conference call in 1 hour," he snapped. "If this isn't fixed by then, heads will roll." His eyes swept the hall, daring anyone to challenge him. David lowered his gaze, but his mind was already working. Numbers arranged themselves in patterns behind his eyes, neat as tiles. He knew where to look. He knew what to find. Later, as the building emptied for the night, David lingered again. The boardroom was dark, save for the glow of a forgotten tablet left charging. Papers littered the table. He moved quietly, almost reverently, setting his cart aside. His hand brushed over the documents, eyes scanning columns of figures. There it was, a duplicate entry, disguised in a maze of accounts, small on its own, but snowballing into millions when unchecked. The kind of error arrogant men overlooked because they never believed the cracks could spread. David slipped the tablet closed, replaced the papers, and returned to his cart. His face betrayed nothing, but his pulse thudded with a quiet certainty. Richard Calloway was standing on a cliff edge, and David Mercer was the only man in the building who saw the ground crumbling beneath him. The office tower was nearly empty by the time David Mercer began his late-night rounds. The lights had dimmed to a soft glow, leaving corridors washed in half-shadows. Most employees had fled hours ago, unwilling to linger in the tension that had spread like a virus since news of the missing funds leaked. Only a few figures remained, Richard Calloway among them, his office still ablaze with light, his silhouette pacing back and forth behind glass. David kept his movements deliberate, cart squeaking faintly as he pushed it toward the boardroom. He knew better than to linger near Richard when his temper ran wild. Tonight, though, something tugged at him. He paused outside the boardroom, eyes drawn to the table inside. It was covered in abandoned papers, financial reports, and marked-up ledgers left behind by panicked staff. He glanced down the hall. No one. Quietly, he wheeled his cart inside. The smell of coffee and ink hung in the air. He set down his mop, then bent and reached beneath the pile of rags on his cart. His fingers closed around the familiar leather handle of his briefcase. He hadn't opened it at work in years, not once. Yet tonight, he pulled it free, setting it gently on the polished mahogany table. The sight of it there was jarring, the battered leather against gleaming wood, a relic of humility placed in the heart of luxury. David unclasped it with care. Inside, the old tools of his past life waited: pens, folded documents, and a small notebook worn soft from years of use. He pulled it free, flipped past the first pages, and began to jot numbers with swift, efficient strokes. The reports on the table were sloppy, rushed. He sifted through them, laying one beside another, scanning for patterns. And there they were, errors hidden in plain sight. Duplicate entries, mismatched accounts, transfers designed to conceal more than they revealed. The kind of mistake no one else in the building could trace quickly, not with the panic and pressure Richard was inflicting on them. David's pen moved faster. His body leaned in, every motion sharp with focus. The world around him fell away, just as it had in another life. The dim hum of computers replaced by the rush of thought, the sound of numbers aligning into sense. The leather briefcase, worn and scuffed, was his anchor. It reminded him who he had been and who he still was beneath the uniform. He barely noticed the door shift until footsteps crossed the carpet. Clara Jennings stood at the threshold, her brows drawn together in surprise. "You're still here?" David looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "So are you." Her gaze drifted to the papers spread before him, the notebook open, the pen poised between his fingers. She stepped inside, lowering her voice. "You're not just cleaning, are you?" David closed the notebook, but didn't hide it. "Just making sense of what others left behind." Clara approached the table, scanning the pages. Her eyes widened. "These are the discrepancies. You found them?" He met her stare, calm but steady. "I see patterns, that's all." Clara's breath caught. She'd suspected, yes, but suspicion was different from seeing it laid bare. The janitor, the quiet man who mopped floors, had just solved a problem half the executive team had failed to untangle. "You have to tell them," she whispered. David shook his head. "Not yet. He wouldn't believe me. He'd sooner burn me than admit I was right." Clara hesitated. "Then why do this?" He leaned back, eyes lowering to the briefcase. "Because letting this go unchecked will hurt more than him. It'll bleed the company dry. People will lose jobs, pensions, families will suffer. I won't let his arrogance cost innocent people everything." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Her eyes softened, the weight of his words pressing against her doubts. She nodded once, reluctantly, and stepped back. "Be careful," she murmured. "If he catches you—" "I know." When she left, David gathered the documents neatly, returning the reports to the pile as though untouched. He tucked his notebook back into the briefcase, slid it under the mop rags, and wheeled his cart out into the corridor. The building was silent again, but his mind was alive, sharper than it had been in years. Down the hall, Richard's voice suddenly cut through the quiet, muffled by glass but filled with fury. "Find it! I don't care how! Just make it disappear!" David didn't stop walking. He knew now exactly what Richard was trying to bury. And he knew, sooner or later, the truth would demand to be seen. The janitor with the mop carried the secret in his briefcase, and when the time came, it would be the weapon no one saw coming. By the end of the week, David Mercer could feel it in the air, like static before a storm. Whispers moved faster than emails. People glanced up when he entered a room, then turned away too quickly. The story of the janitor who solved problems others couldn't had stretched beyond a few hushed corners. Now it was something larger, something dangerous. It came to a head in the elevator. David had just finished wiping down the chrome panels in the lobby when the call light dinged. The doors slid open, revealing Clara Jennings and two other managers already inside. Their conversation halted mid-sentence the moment they saw him. He stepped in silently, cart left behind, pressing the button for the executive floor. The elevator hummed upward, the air thick with unease. One of the managers, a man named Caro, with slicked-back hair and an expensive watch, broke the silence first. He leaned against the rail, smirking. "So it's true, isn't it?" The janitor knows accounting better than the finance team. David didn't answer. Clara's jaw tightened. "Caro!" But Caro pressed on. "Tell me, Mercer, how'd you do it? Night classes, YouTube tutorials, or maybe you're just lucky?" The second manager, a younger woman clutching a folder, frowned but stayed quiet. Her eyes darted between David and Caro nervously, caught between curiosity and discomfort. David's reflection in the polished steel stared back at him, calm, unreadable. "Luck has nothing to do with it," Caro chuckled, though there was no humor in the sound. "Well, whatever it is, you'd better be careful. Richard doesn't like being shown up, especially not by—" His words trailed into a sneer. "Help." The elevator stopped at the 25th floor. The young woman slipped out quickly, leaving the tension thicker. Clara crossed her arms, her gaze pinned on David. Her tone was quieter but sharper. "You did fix it, didn't you? The discrepancy in the ledgers? It wasn't luck." David turned his head slightly toward her. The floor lights above the door ticked upward, 26, 27, 28. His voice was low but steady. "I saw what was there, nothing more." Clara's eyes narrowed, searching his expression. She looked like someone holding a puzzle piece, trying to see the full picture. Caro snorted. "Careful, Jennings. Don't waste your time. He'll be gone as soon as this blows over." The elevator chimed, doors opening on the executive floor. Caro strode out first, tossing a look over his shoulder. "Some people don't know their place." David followed, his pace unhurried, his silence deeper than words. Clara lingered at his side. "You're not who you say you are," she murmured, barely audible. "And I don't think you ever were." He didn't respond, but the flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes was enough. They stepped out into a corridor buzzing with activity. Assistants darted between offices carrying files. Voices spilled out of the boardroom, sharp, clipped, desperate. Richard's anger carried above them all, the words distinct. "If we don't plug this hole, we're finished." David wheeled his cart down the hall, the mop bucket rattling softly. Behind him, Clara stood still, unsettled by what she'd just seen. The janitor's silence was no longer the quiet of a man resigned. It was the quiet of a man waiting. That evening, as the building emptied, David returned to the elevator. Alone this time. His reflection met him again, but now his gaze was sharper, his posture straighter. He thought of Evelyn, pale under hospital lights. He thought of Richard's laughter echoing down corridors. He thought of the $2 million bleeding out of ledgers while men like Caro called him help. When the elevator doors opened on the lobby, he stepped out with a new certainty. The whispers were no longer something he could ignore. They were a warning. His cover was thinning, and the storm was drawing closer. He pushed his cart into the night air, the leather briefcase hidden beneath rags. The city stretched before him in neon and steel, indifferent to who carried power and who carried buckets. But David knew the truth now. Calloway's empire wasn't untouchable. It was already cracking. And when it broke, he would be standing at the fault line. The boardroom had never felt heavier. Morning sunlight poured through the glass walls, glinting off polished wood and stainless steel. But it did nothing to soften the atmosphere. The long mahogany table was lined with directors, each of them with files spread out, pens tapping nervously. A murmur of tension filled the air, punctuated by sharp coughs and shifting chairs. At the head sat Richard Calloway, his jaw tight, his usual arrogance thinned into something closer to desperation. David Mercer stood near the back, mop bucket stationed quietly by the wall. He had been summoned here by circumstance, nothing more. He was supposed to be invisible, the man who made the fingerprints vanish from the glass doors. And yet, every nerve in his body told him this was the moment he had tried so hard to avoid. Richard slammed a folder shut with a crack. $2 million, he spat. Gone, and all I hear are excuses. auditors dragging their feet, analysts choking on their own incompetence. This company doesn't pay me to babysit. It pays me to lead, so give me something I can work with. No one spoke. The silence was almost physical, pressing in from all sides. David's eyes swept the table. The reports in front of them were the same ones he had seen the night before, bloated with mistakes, obscured by panic. He could see the errors as clearly as ink stains on white cloth. One director cleared his throat nervously. "Richard, if we bring this to the board at large without a resolution, we'll lose confidence. Investors will smell blood." Richard sneered. "Then find the leak." Clara Jennings shifted in her chair, her gaze flicking toward David at the back of the room. Her lips pressed tight, as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. The words slipped from David before he could stop them. "The leak isn't missing money, it's duplication." Every head turned. The directors blinked in confusion. Richard's eyes snapped to David, his expression hardening into disbelief and anger. "What did you just say?" David didn't flinch. He stepped forward, calm, each movement deliberate. "The entries aren't gone. They've been mirrored across accounts. Someone logged the same transactions in two separate ledgers. At first glance, it looks like a loss, but in reality, it's an illusion. A bad one, at that." A ripple of murmurs ran around the table. Directors bent toward their documents, flipping through pages with sudden urgency. One older board member frowned. That would explain the balance shift. Another tapped his pen against the margin. If he's right, then the shortfall is recoverable. Richard's face flushed red. He barked out a laugh that sounded more like a snarl. "You're telling me we're taking financial advice from a janitor? A man with a mop?" David let the insult hang. Then he placed the worn leather briefcase on the table with quiet finality. Its presence silenced the room. He opened it, revealing neat stacks of papers, his notebook filled with precise figures and annotations. "These numbers are wrong," he said evenly, sliding a page across the table. "Here and here. They repeat under two codes. I traced the entire flow. If you reroute the entries properly, the supposed loss collapses. It isn't 2 million missing. It's 2 million misfiled." The room fell into stunned quiet. Directors leaned over the paper, eyes widening as they followed the clean logic David laid out. Clara's breath caught, her suspicion now replaced by certainty. Richard slammed his hand against the table. "This is absurd! You expect me to believe a man who scrubs floors knows more than trained analysts?" But his voice cracked. He could feel the weight of the board turning. A silver-haired director spoke up, voice calm but firm. "Richard, he's right. I see it clearly. It explains everything we've been missing. If this had reached investors," he shook his head, "we'd have been destroyed." Others nodded in agreement. Murmurs of relief spread, tempered with unease. Richard's glare shifted back to David. "Who the hell are you?" David's gaze was steady, his voice low but unshakable. "Someone who's cleaned up bigger messes than this. You should be asking why none of your experts saw what I did." The boardroom erupted, not in applause, but in restless murmurs, a current of doubt sweeping through the polished chamber. For the first time, Richard looked smaller in his seat, his authority chipped by the undeniable truth spread across the table. David closed his briefcase and stepped back, the silence returning to him like armor. He had not raised his voice, had not boasted. He had simply revealed what was already there, what arrogance had blinded them all from seeing. And in that moment, the janitor was no longer invisible. The boardroom hadn't calmed since David Mercer's quiet revelation. The directors shuffled their papers, whispering to one another in low, uneasy tones. Their eyes darted between Richard Calloway, red-faced at the head of the table, and the janitor, who had just dismantled the crisis in a handful of sentences. Richard stood, trying to reclaim control. "Enough of this circus," he snapped, slamming his palm onto the table. "We are not going to let a maintenance man dictate the direction of this company." But the room didn't echo his outrage. Instead, the directors leaned back in their chairs, some skeptical, some thoughtful. A silver-haired board member adjusted his glasses, tapping one of the documents David had corrected. "With respect, Richard, this maintenance man has just saved us from walking into a shareholder meeting blind. If what he's saying holds, and I believe it does, we're not staring at a loss. We're staring at an error, one we should have caught. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Richard's eyes narrowed. You're letting a janitor embarrass you. Another director, younger and sharper, shook his head. No, Richard, we're acknowledging reality, and right now, he seems to be the only one in this room who understands it. Clara Jennings spoke up then, her voice careful but steady. He's been noticing things for days, finance errors, system failures. I think it's time we admit David Mercer isn't who we assumed he was. The words landed heavily. Richard's gaze shot to Clara, betrayal flashing across his features. You're siding with him? Clara didn't flinch. I'm siding with the truth. David remained still at the back of the room, hands resting lightly on his briefcase. His silence was not weakness, it was strength, the kind that forced people to lean in rather than turn away. Finally, the silver-haired board member looked directly at him. Mr. Mercer, what did you do before you worked here? David's eyes met his steadily. I was a financial strategist. I built models like these for firms larger than this one. I walked away from that world when I realized it was costing me more than it gave. My daughter needed a father, not a man chasing zeros on a screen. The honesty in his words silenced even the whispers. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city outside the glass walls. Richard tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. So, you expect us to believe this? That a man who scrubs our floors used to sit at a table like this? One of the directors leaned forward. I don't just believe it. I can see it in the work. And frankly, Richard, the fact that he caught what your team missed says more about him, and about you, than you realize. The room shifted. The power that had always orbited Richard wavered, drifting toward the quiet man at the back. Richard's face darkened. You think this changes anything? He'll go back to his mop tomorrow, and we'll forget this ever happened. But no one looked convinced. The directors weren't laughing. The assistants at the edges of the room weren't smirking. Instead, there was a new tension in their eyes. Respect, curiosity, even guilt. Clara broke the silence. You can try to humiliate him again, Richard, but everyone in this room knows what just happened. We all saw who solved the problem, and it wasn't you. The blow landed harder than any raised voice could. Richard's jaw clenched, but he had no answer. David lifted the briefcase, tucking it under his arm. I don't need recognition. I don't want your titles or your applause. But don't mistake silence for ignorance. Some of us see more from the corners of the room than others ever will from the head of the table. With that, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving a boardroom full of shaken men and women in his wake. Behind him, the directors exchanged glances, murmuring about what it meant, about Richard, about the company, about the janitor who wasn't truly a janitor at all. Richard slumped back into his chair, fury twisting his features. For the first time in years, he wasn't laughing. He wasn't sneering. He was the one being measured, weighed, and found lacking. And outside, in the hushed corridors, word of what had happened began to spread. The janitor had spoken, and the board had listened. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the glass lobby of Callaway Holdings, casting long streaks across the polished floor. David Mercer pushed his cart slowly through the entrance, the wheels squeaking in their familiar rhythm. But something in the air had changed. Employees who once brushed past him without a glance now paused to nod, to smile, even to murmur quiet greetings. Some looked away quickly, ashamed of the laughter they had joined when Richard mocked him. The whispers weren't scorn anymore. They were respect, tinged with disbelief. David kept his face calm, his stride unhurried. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here, as always, for Evelyn. She walked beside him this time, her small hand clutching the handle of his battered leather briefcase. The doctors had cleared her after her collapse, prescribing a stricter diet and regular monitoring. She was pale, but smiling, her braid bouncing against her shoulder as she carried the symbol of her father's hidden life like a badge of honor. In the corner of the lobby, Clara Jennings approached, her expression softer than David had ever seen it. You've shaken this place, she said quietly. David glanced at her, one eyebrow lifting. I didn't mean to. Maybe not, Clara replied. But you did, and people needed to see it. She hesitated before adding, Richard won't admit it out loud, but yesterday broke him. He's not untouchable anymore. David gave no response. He simply nodded and continued on, Evelyn still at his side. Near the reception desk, a young analyst whispered to a colleague, "That's him, the one who saved the board from collapse." Evelyn heard it. She squeezed her father's hand and looked up at him with quiet pride. "They know now?" she whispered. David smiled faintly, his eyes warming. "That doesn't matter. What matters is you know." Together, they walked toward the elevator. The janitor's cart rattled softly, its worn mop handle leaning like an old companion. But the briefcase Evelyn carried drew every eye. The contrast was stark. The tools of humility beside the relic of power. Both belonged to David, and both told the truth of who he was. In his office above, Richard Calloway sat slumped at his desk, staring out at the skyline. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the board members' sidelong glances. The empire he built on arrogance now had cracks, and it was the janitor, the man he had sneered at, who exposed them. Down in the lobby, David and Evelyn stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off the chatter of employees. The silence inside was heavy but peaceful. Evelyn leaned against her father's arm. "Dad?" "Yes." "Will you ever tell them everything about who you used to be?" David thought for a long moment, watching the floor numbers tick upward. "Maybe, but not because I need them to know. Only if it helps someone else." Her smile widened, and she rested her head against him. When the elevator opened, they stepped out into the corridor bathed in morning light. David resumed his quiet work, mopping, polishing, moving unnoticed. Except now, every person who passed him saw more than a uniform. They saw the man who had saved their company with nothing but a notebook, a briefcase, and a lifetime of knowledge hidden behind silence. And though Richard Calloway would never say it aloud, the truth had already reshaped the building. The janitor was no longer invisible. David didn't need to win titles or fortunes or applause. His victory was Evelyn's hand in his, her voice steady and proud. That was enough. Because in the end, dignity was never about recognition. It was about never letting anyone take away the truth of who you were. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story. They said his kind doesn't belong here. Then, his $6.4 million donation renamed the school. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?